So welcome again to this pre-congress workshop webinar with Shannon Murphy about the Neuroscience of Inclusion, New Skills for New Times. I'm very much looking forward to it, and Shannon, this is your turn now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very briefly, I'm going to be presenting on the neuroscience of inclusion and really looking at it from the perspective of what are some ways that the brain can trip us up in our ability to be inclusive, to use good cultural dexterity and be culturally agile, because there are some key ways that the brain can work both for us and against us. And that's a lot of what I will be looking at in the pre-congress workshop. Very briefly, you can see my bio up on the screen. I come from a diversity and inclusion and intercultural management background. My master's is in intercultural communication and intercultural management with leadership development emphasis. And then I've combined that with the neuroscience, and in 2012, achieved advanced certification as a neurobusiness coach at Harvard with Dr. Srini Pillai, who teaches at the medical school there. And really the driving interest into the neuroscience was a somewhat roundabout venture. My youngest daughter was born with Down syndrome, and when she was born, I knew very little about Down syndrome. That all turned out to be incorrect, old stereotypes, and a lot of misinformation. You know, not a real helpful starting point as a parent. And so her first year of life was like a crash course where I was reading anything and everything I could, from genetics to cellular biology, biochemistry, neuroscience, all these different things, trying to wrap my arms around, okay, so she has this extra chromosome, my daughter Annabelle. She has the most common form of Down syndrome called trisomy 21. You know, what does that really mean? And more importantly, how do I help her be who she's fully here to be? And the more I read about the neuroscience, and in particular neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change, the more excited I got, because I thought this isn't helpful just for Annabelle, this is helpful for everybody. And so I continued doing a lot of research in that area. My colleague and co-founder of Brain Skills at Work, Mary Casey, and I have done a tremendous amount of research in this, particularly looking at the intersection of what we now know about with neuroscience and how that can help us be more inclusive. Because thanks to advances in technology, the MRI and the fMRI in particular, we have this unprecedented window under the hood, so to speak. For the first time, neuroscientists can look at and study the brain in real time while we're engaged in critical thought, while we're engaged in analysis, problem solving, so forth. And it's shedding a tremendous amount of information that's really helpful when we look at it through the lens of inclusion and developing cultural agility and being able to really work across differences effectively. And that's what the pre-congress workshop will be focusing on, will be the neuroscience of inclusion, new skills for new times. And really looking at this interplay between, there's aspects of the brain that work for us when it comes to working across differences, and there's aspects of the brain that work against us when working across differences. And we can really now be much more conscious and much more intentional in how we work with the brain to really advance our ability to work across differences effectively. And the good news, this is where neuroplasticity comes in, we now know from the neuroscience research that we can shape the brain and we can actually help it to cultivate curiosity, to move toward the positive, to be more kind, compassionate, and caring across differences, because that is actually a little bit challenging for the brain, and I'll talk about that. to be able to manage and even override networks that can interfere with being inclusive. And we can build new behavioral habits more effectively, access higher levels of self-awareness, and as you know, self-awareness is critical to being culturally agile and being able to understand self and other better, and then to be able to pursue transformational thinking. So when we look at it from a brain perspective, oh, before I go on, I do want to mention that if you have any questions as I go, please put them into the chat box, and Barbara, our moderator, will read those for me so that I can get a chance to address any questions that you've got. Now, when it comes to inclusion and to working across cultures and differences effectively, what neuroscience is making really clear in the research is that despite our good intentions, the brain absolutely can trip us up. So I have a question for you. How long, when you first see someone, how long do you think it takes your brain to register if that person is like you or not like you? Take a moment and type your answers into the chat box. And then Barbara, if you would be so kind as to read some of those as they come in. So how long do you think it takes the brain to register if that person you see is like you or not like you?
Whoa, we have already the first answer, about 80 milliseconds. Oh dear God, and I was wondering, how do I put like less than a second? And there it is, milliseconds apparently.
Indeed, it is milliseconds. Indeed. The studies show in as little as 200 milliseconds, the unconscious brain has already noticed if the person is like you or not. And it happens unconsciously very, very, very quickly. So what's interesting is what some of the studies are showing when it comes to inclusion is that, one, our brains prefer people who look like us over people who don't. So it lends itself to some interesting biases that way. Our brains can register differences, particularly if they're unfamiliar or if they cause any discomfort in any way. It can be registered in the brain as a threat. You know, you think back to the survival circuitry of the brain, which is very much alive and well. The brain had to very quickly make decisions, like me, not like me, friend, foe, comfortable, not comfortable. And as these happen so quickly, unconsciously in the brain, what actually happens is they trigger different circuitry in the brain of either I see you like me, I'm comfortable, which then makes it easier to move toward you and engage, or my brain registers the difference as discomfort, uncertain, potential threat. It triggers circuitry to move away, which can then in fact make it more difficult and challenging to engage. And all of this happens very quickly, very unconsciously. Now, what's interesting is also change, complexity, a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty can also tax the brain's resources, and they directly can impact our levels of perception, our levels of awareness, and our ability to make intentional and conscious choices. What's really interesting is that the research is showing is that perception is not static in the brain. Neither is awareness, self-awareness in particular. And what region of the brain is dominating in the moment directly impacts our perception, our self-awareness, and our ability to make conscious choices. And we know in terms of having cultural dexterity and being able to work across differences effectively, we need high levels of self-awareness. We need to be able to frame shift. We need to be able to hold multiple perspectives, and which region of the brain is dominating in the moment will absolutely impact our ability to do that effectively. Also, the defensive, it's interesting, the brain is in many ways built on the defensive. It's wired in a way that its job is to protect us and ensure our survival. And there's aspects of that that are still very alive and well today. You know, a long time ago, the threats were probably, you know, tigers, lions, bears. Nowadays, it may be someone's boss. It may be the uncertainty of a reorganization happening within a company or business or organization. A lot of different things now that can still trigger the defensive brain. And we lose access to the higher brain in the process, or sometimes referred to as the prefrontal cortex. It's part of the newest part of the brain. And we lose access to that, which can make it really challenging, especially in communication. And that's where a lot of our work looks at. How can we manage these brain dynamics more effectively, particularly when we're working together and communicating, to be as effective as possible. And then there's other aspects and dynamics that we'll be getting into during the workshop of the unconscious brain, how it operates on patterns, maps, heuristics, which are really shortcuts, and biases. You know, what's interesting is really the brain is in many ways a bias-making machine. And so recognizing that becomes really important so that we can begin to look at what some of those dynamics are that feed into biases, and then how, even perhaps more importantly, we can really learn to notice and manage and override and even repattern those biases more effectively and more positively. So we really need skills to be able to manage the different ways that the brain can trip us up. And that's really what a lot of the focus of the pre-congress workshop is going to be on. Really two key aspects. One being understanding what some of the key dynamics are that interfere with inclusion and working across cultures and differences effectively. And then two, what are skills and very practical tools and strategies that we can use to manage these brain dynamics more effectively. And I want to pause for just a moment and check in, Barbara. Are there any questions before I continue?
Just looking at the chat window, I think we're perfectly fine following you. There is no question. But
Okay.
Please, to all of the participants, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them in the chat window.
Yes, thank you. Then I will continue on. Some of the key topics that we'll be really going into depth during the one-day pre-congress workshop. There's 4 main skill areas that we'll be focusing on during the time. The first one is understanding the unconscious brain. The second one is being able to manage the defensive brain. The third one is all around how can we engage the higher brain and keep it online more and more of the time, because there's a lot of things that can destabilize it and take it offline, and we don't even realize we've lost access. And then building the positive brain, which it turns out is really, really crucial and tremendously beneficial in helping us work across differences effectively. I'll highlight just a couple of the things that we'll be learning about in the workshop that ties with these skills. One of the pieces we'll be learning to recognize and manage brain states. And so it's really looking at how we can be able to access higher levels of perception, be able to make more intentional conscious choices, and have higher levels of self-awareness as we're interacting across differences. One of the core models that I'll be going into and teaching will be the brain states management model, and it's a way to begin to recognize the interplay of perception, self-awareness, and choice in the brain, and how these are impacted by what brain region is dominating in the moment. And the good news is with skills and tools, we can actually learn to recognize and manage these very, very effectively. You'll also have the opportunity to take the Brain States Management Self-Assessment, which is a corresponding self-assessment that will give you insight into your own brain state tendencies. It looks at 7 different neuroscience-based dimensions that all help us to be able to shape a more inclusive brain, work across differences more effectively, and really be able to manage our brain states in a very proactive way. So those are some of the pieces and the methodology that we'll be looking at. We will also be delving into the neuroscience of appreciation. This is part of that 4th skill that the workshop will be covering on building the positive brain. There's a wealth of really exciting, really good research coming out from neuroscience and the study of positive emotions. And the neuroscience of appreciation in particular is really, really helpful in terms of building our capacity to be more inclusive, and in terms of fundamentally increasing the brain's ability to work across differences effectively. What's interesting is that there's innate social circuitry in the brain already. There is social circuitry that helps us extend care and kindness, demonstrate empathy, all of those things with others. However, the social circuitry of the brain engages more easily with people we see like us. And so we have to actually strengthen the ability to do that across differences, and we can. And so we'll also be spending time during the workshop looking at some skills and some specific tools that help us do that, and that help create more affiliation with others and help strengthen the brain's ability to extend empathy, to extend care, kindness, and compassion across differences, even if they make us feel uncomfortable or they're unfamiliar. So you'll receive specific models and tools that really help build the positive brain, and all of the tools, this is where neuroplasticity absolutely comes in our favor. All of the tools, the models, the skills, and the strategies are all designed to help strengthen the brain's innate ability to be inclusive and culturally agile. So they very much are brain-based and target different ways in very simple, practical ways that we can get better at working inclusively. The SAVE communication model is one example of, it's based on the neuroscience of appreciation, and it's a very practical model for communicating across differences, particularly if they're challenging conversations or stressful conversations, because that's when often the brain will derail and work against us. And so the SAVE communication model is a communication process that supports the brain while also supporting our ability to stay in curiosity and stay in appreciation. So that gives a high-level overview of some of the things that we will be talking about. And again, it's going to be a very interactive workshop during the day. You'll be moving in and out of a lot of different discussions, activities, and so forth. There'll be opportunities for self-reflection, opportunities for application, so that this is really practical, useful information and tools and skills that you can walk away with at the end of the day and begin applying immediately. So I hope you join us for the Neuroscience of Inclusion, New Skills for New Times Pre-Congress Workshop. It is scheduled for May 24th, and then the Congress will open officially that evening. So Barbara, I'm going to turn it back over to you so you can see if there's any other questions before we conclude.
Thank you very much, Shannon. So please, again, type in all your questions and I'm going to collect them so that Shannon has the possibility to answer them. Well, I'm just picking one of the first questions here. So the assessment tool about the brain test you were mentioning a few slides before, is it a tool that can be also used when we are trained with the tool as participants of your workshop, so that we can, for example, use that tool with our groups, or is it a tool that we are just going to use on ourselves?
Yes and yes. The assessment is a tool we will use in the workshop, so you can get personal insight. And if it's something that you would be interested in being able to use and incorporate into trainings or your work, that is something that we do offer certifications in the self-assessment. That won't be part of the one-day workshop because there just wouldn't be enough time, but that is absolutely an option for anyone that may be of interest.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Great. And there is another question. You were talking about unconscious processes, and so that kind of brain test gives you an insight about those unconscious processes or biases. So is that tool, it's very neuroscience, from the part of neuroscience or from the background of neuroscience. What is the difference between this tool and, I'm not sure if you're aware of the Harvard implicit bias test?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they're different. The IAT, the implicit association test, or it's often just called the IAT, is a wonderful, if anyone hasn't heard of it, highly recommended, wonderful resource for getting insight into unconscious bias. And it's very effective for illustrating that. There's a whole variety of different topics that the tests are built around. So I would highly encourage you to go and take several different ones. They're very insightful and illuminating. The brain states management self-assessment is different. The brain state management self-assessment looks at 7 different dimensions that are neuroscience-based that underlie our ability to manage brain states and be able to maintain and maximize access to the higher brain. So for instance, metacognition is one of the dimensions. There's 7 different ones that really all are interrelated facets that can help us. Strengthening those dimensions can help us to be able to be in the higher brain more of the time, which is where we can be most effective in crossing cultures and communicating effectively. In fact, if you were to look at and break down all of the different behaviors that we would want someone to be able to exhibit, that is being culturally agile and culturally responsive and inclusive, those different competencies would all map to the higher brain as higher brain capacities. And when we lose access to the higher brain, we lose access to those capacities. So part of it is also looking at how we can strengthen those 7 dimensions to improve our overall capacity, because that's where we'll be most effective. It's also where we'll have best performance, most engagement. You know, it ties to a lot of different things.
Okay, thank you very much. Just looking at the chat window, there is no more question coming up. So it's just up to me to thank you again for the very insightful 26 minutes with you now. For you as participants, just to let you know that until the end of March, we're still offering the early bird fee. So if you want to get registered for the Congress and also for the pre-congress workshops, please have a look at the webpage and don't miss this opportunity. Shannon, to you again, thank you very much for sharing your insights with you in the past 26, 27 minutes, and looking very much forward to seeing all of you in Dublin.